Welcome to the Nutrition Talk. We have Maria here from Nutriworks, which is a professional group of nutritionists who are also highly skilled athletes that understand what athletes go through. We have a number of runners that have worked with their program to fine-tune their nutrition for big events, half marathon, marathon, which you'd be amazed what a difference the right nutrition makes. So that's what Maria's here to teach us all about tonight. And so take notes. There's also, you have like a QR information?
Yes, at the end of the presentation, I will have a QR code that you can scan, and it will give you samples for fueling before exercise, which we're going to talk about today, for recovery afterwards, and then also a sample of a race day. So you can download that and see kind of what fueling should look like.
Pay attention, and
yeah,
it's all yours.
All right, thank you so much. Well, yes, so as was mentioned, we're going to be talking all about nutrition today, but I want to really focus in on nutrition around performance. So what I mean by that is, what do we need to be taking in before exercise, anytime we're preparing to go out on a run? What do we need to be focusing on consuming during exercise and then after exercise? So there are 4 key things that we are going to be touching on in depth today that are related to nutrition surrounding exercise, so before, during, after training. And those 4 things, the first component is going to be hydration. Now, I want to put a big emphasis on hydration right now because we're finally seeing the 100-degree weather that we were hoping wouldn't come this year, but it's here. So, of course, when we are exercising in warmer weather, hydration becomes a little bit more important. So when we are talking about hydration, there are 2 things we're going to talk about. That's fluid, and how do we figure out how much fluid we need to be consuming, and then also something called electrolytes, which are certain minerals that we consume that help us to retain fluid, and that also play some important roles in our muscles functioning when we exercise. So those are the first 2 things that you're going to hear me talk about quite a lot today. And then carbohydrates are the next thing we're going to put a big emphasis on. So carbohydrates are essentially our body's fuel source. So anytime our muscles are exercising and we are training, anything above, I would say about 60% of your maximum, your muscles are largely relying on carbohydrates for energy. And so they're very important when we're training because usually we are at that threshold or above. And so our muscles are largely using carbs for energy. So we'll talk about what do we need to be focusing on when it comes to carbohydrate intake before exercise, during exercise, and afterwards. And then we'll also talk about protein. So protein's also going to be very important, largely for recovery from exercise. So it is one of the main things that we need in order to support recovery, because our muscles and really all the tissue in our body is comprised of protein. So when we exercise, it causes a little bit of damage to our muscles. And so that's going to require that building block to support recovery and rebuilding of those muscles. So it's going to require protein. So we'll talk about protein in the context of recovery. Okay, so let's jump into talking a little bit about fluid and why we care about staying hydrated. So, we hear all about the importance of hydration in the context of training and exercise, but also just in everyday life. So why does it matter? So if you look at our bodies, roughly 60% of our body is comprised of fluid. Largely, our organs are comprised of fluid, especially our lean tissue is comprised of fluid. So just what makes us up and allows our body to function on an everyday basis is an adequate amount of fluid in the body. But also it's going to play a lot of important roles in the body. So whenever we're trying to transport things to our muscles or any other organ, that's going to require an adequate amount of fluid in our muscle cells and also in our blood. So if we're dehydrated, then we can't transport the nutrients we need to support energy production when we're training. And so we're going to struggle with energy levels when we are exercising. The other thing that fluid allows us to do is get rid of the waste that builds up when we exercise. So if we can't do that effectively, then we're going to see an impact on recovery and we're going to fatigue more quickly. Then the other thing that we see a big role that fluid plays in is temperature regulation. So our body has a couple ways that it's able to keep our body temperature right in this narrow range where we want it to be. We don't want to get higher than that because that's going to start to cause some breakdown of our lean tissue and some serious issues like heat exhaustion, heat stroke, things we don't want. So when we are dehydrated, we are not able to maintain our body temperature as well as when we are well hydrated. And then, of course, our ability to sweat also starts to decline. So if we get to a point of dehydration where we're not sweating, our body temperature is going to skyrocket. And that's usually when we start to see big issues like heat stroke and those types of things that, of course, we want to avoid when we're training in the summer. So those are some of the roles of fluid. In addition to that, fluid is also going to be critical in preventing injury. So I like to use kind of an analogy to help you to understand why that might be. And it actually relates a little bit to beef jerky, which we were talking about earlier. So if you think of your muscles as if they were a piece of raw meat, right? You take a piece of raw steak, and if you were to put force on that steak, similar to the force that we're putting on our muscles when we exercise and the impact that happens when we're running, that steak is pretty pliable, right? If we kind of pound at it and pull at it, it's not really going to tear. At least if we're pulling at it, not super aggressively, we're probably not going to see tears. But then we take that steak and let's say we dehydrate it and we make beef jerky, and then we pull at it. It's not so pliable anymore, right? It's much more likely to tear and get damaged or to rip apart. So of course our muscles are not going to get to a point where they look like beef jerky. They're not that dehydrated, but even still, they aren't as pliable and they aren't as resistant to that impact that happens with exercise. So muscle tears, muscle strains, impact on our tendons and ligaments, all of that increases in risk when we are dehydrated, when we're exercising. So that's something we want to keep in mind as well. If we can maintain hydration, that helps to reduce the risk of injury. And when I'm talking about dehydration, it really doesn't have to be extreme levels of dehydration to start to see an impact on performance. Even what would be considered 2% of your body weight lost is already considered dehydration. And we'll talk a little bit more about what I mean by that when we talk about sweat tests in a little bit. But at that point, you're already going to see an impact on energy levels, on how difficult the workout feels. So there's something called rate of perceived exertion. That's going to go up the more dehydrated we get, right? So let's say we're going out on an easy run, but we're dehydrated. It's going to feel a lot harder and our heart rate's going to be a lot higher than if we were well hydrated. Even if we're going the exact same pace, the same temperature outside, if we start that run dehydrated, we're going to feel like it's a lot harder than it should be, right? So that's something to keep in mind. And then, of course, we start to see an increase in injury risk if we're dehydrated. So lots of reasons why we want to put a big emphasis on hydration and what we're going to be talking about today. And then electrolytes are going to go hand in hand when it comes to hydration with fluid. So electrolytes, I mentioned earlier, they are several minerals that we consume that disassociate in fluid and allow us to control where fluid is in our body. So the most common electrolytes that we are thinking about in the context of sport, because they are what we lose in our sweat, are going to be sodium, potassium, calcium, and magnesium. But sodium is really going to be the main one we are losing through sweat. So that's why if you've ever tasted your sweat, it tastes very salty because it does have a high amount of sodium. So when we start talking about how much sodium do I need to be taking in during or after exercise to help replenish what I'm losing through sweat, I'm mainly talking in sodium numbers because that's the main electrolyte that we're losing. So in terms of the functions of electrolytes, I mentioned this earlier, they're going to help us to control where fluid goes in our body. They also help us to hold on to fluid a little bit better. So that's why if you've ever been to a meal out, like you go to a steakhouse, you have a meal out, it's going to be real high in sodium. Usually there's a lot of sodium added to food in the form of salt because it provides flavor. So if the next day you're noticing, my rings are kind of hard to put on or my feet look a little puffy, the reason for that is because we're seeing a lot of fluid retention from the sodium, it kind of acts like a sponge. In the case of when we're trying to stay well hydrated during exercise, that can actually be helpful because it helps us to hold on to fluid a little bit better so that we're not just peeing it all out as quickly. In terms of the other electrolytes, so like I said, sodium is pretty easy to find in a lot of our food because it provides flavor. It's also in any processed food item you buy at the grocery store: cereal, granola, chips, crackers, frozen food. All that's going to be high in sodium because not only does it provide flavor, it also acts as a preservative. So we really don't have a hard time getting sodium in our everyday life. We really focus on sodium replenishment during exercise because if we're out there for long enough, that's when we're not able to keep up with our needs. But on a day-to-day basis, most Americans overconsume sodium, so that one's not as hard to find in our food. Potassium is going to be a little lower in the American diet because it's found in a lot of our healthy foods. And so if we are looking at the traditional American diet, a lot of people are not consuming that many whole grains, fruits, vegetables, those types of things, and that's usually where we're finding our potassium. So, you hear about potassium in bananas, it's also in potatoes and tomatoes and melons. So you're able to consume potassium in a lot of your fruits, your vegetables, and your whole grains. Calcium is going to largely be found in our dairy products and fortified foods that have dairy or calcium added to them. So let's say you're lactose intolerant, you can't have dairy. If you consume like almond milk in the morning, maybe in your coffee or in a smoothie, a lot of almond milks, they actually add calcium to them. So if you look at the ingredients and you see calcium in there, that means it's been fortified. So that's a good way to still get some calcium in the diet. And then magnesium is also kind of like potassium in a lot of our healthy foods. So a lot of our nuts and seeds, dark leafy greens, those foods are going to be rich in magnesium. So we definitely want to make sure we're consuming these foods so that we're getting our electrolytes throughout the day. So I'm going to circle back to carbohydrates briefly before we start talking about what do we need before, during, and after exercise. I just want to talk about sources of carbohydrates. So carbohydrates can be something that is a little bit controversial in terms of the information you see online regarding carbohydrates. So there are really two main categories of carbs. There are what are considered simple carbohydrates, and then there are your complex carbohydrates. Now at mealtime, we usually want complex carbohydrates. These are going to be carbohydrates that are less processed, kind of more similar to how you find them in nature. Okay, so whole grains, legumes. So think about beans, chickpeas, lentils, fruit. Those types of sources of carbohydrates, they are great for mealtime. They have something called fiber, which slows digestion, keeps us full, keeps our blood sugar more stable, is really good for gut health. So when we're thinking about, planning just regular breakfast, lunch, dinner, those are the types of carbs we want to be thinking about consuming. However, when we're thinking about what do I need to be consuming right before or during exercise, we don't want a whole lot of food sitting in our GI tract, in our stomach, because it can cause GI distress. So we actually don't want a lot of fiber in our carbohydrates if they are carbs we're taking in right before or during exercise. So that's where our more refined, simple carbohydrates can be beneficial. So that's going to be like your white bread, your regular pasta and crackers, all of our sports nutrition products, sports drinks, chews and candy, and those types of things. They're not going to have fiber, but we can digest them more quickly, which in the context of exercise is what we want happening. We don't want anything kind of sitting in our gut. Okay, so when we talk about carbohydrate sources in the context of before and during exercise, we want to focus more on our kind of more refined carbohydrates that can provide quick energy, that can serve as fuel for our training. In terms of protein, I just want to circle back and briefly talk about some sources of protein. Now, oftentimes people think about protein coming from animal products. That is going to be probably the easiest way to get protein if you do eat animal products. So your eggs are going to be good sources. Dairy products, so there's whey and casein found in dairy. and those are going to be the proteins that we can consume when we consume a dairy product. We can also consume them in powder form when we get a protein powder. So that's another good way to get some protein. Chicken, pork, fish, beef, all of those are going to be excellent sources of protein. If you don't consume animal products, there are plant products that do provide some protein. Soy is going to be one of the best sources of plant-based protein. You can find soy in edamame. You can also find it in soy milk, in tofu, and tempeh. So if you're someone that is vegan, there are still options to make sure you're getting enough protein in. Legumes, so beans and chickpeas, they are also another plant-based source of protein. So like I said, even if we have someone that's not consuming animal products, there are still ways to get protein after exercise when we're talking about that in the context of recovery. Okay, so there's kind of the 4 things we're going to be talking about before, during, and after exercise. Before we jump into that piece, I do want to kind of give some general hydration tips. When I say general hydration tips, I'm talking outside of exercise, on a rest day, or just in the rest of your day after you've trained. What do we need to be shooting to consume in terms of fluid and in terms of electrolytes? So the general recommendation for hydration, this is just kind of what's considered the RDA, or the basic kind of recommendation based off of research for males and females. It's about 90 ounces of fluid for a female per day, and about 125 ounces for a male. So this is not taking into account any additional loss through sweat. This is what we should be targeting to consume on a day-to-day basis. Now, in terms of where that fluid can come from, all of your fluid that you consume outside of alcohol is going to serve to hydrate you. Okay, so let's say you make a smoothie in the morning, or you drink coffee in the morning, or you drink juice or any other kind of beverage. You're making a soup that has broth in there. All of that fluid that you're consuming does factor into that recommendation. But we do want the majority of the fluid to be water, because it's generally going to be considered the best hydrator. So we want at least, I would say, 50 to 75% of that fluid goal to be coming from water throughout the day. And then, of course, you want to think about, if we're consuming a lot of other things that aren't water, are we getting a bunch of added sugar, if it's soda, and those types of things. So oftentimes that's why we want to really be pushing water as that main hydrating source. In terms of timing our fluid consumption, it's also best to try to spread it out as much as we can throughout the day versus sitting down and chugging fluid. So what happens when we sit down and chug a bunch of fluid? It's going to increase our blood volume very quickly. And so our kidneys go, whoa, we don't need that much blood. And so they start to filter out fluid from the blood, and that makes us have to go to the bathroom. And so we end up just peeing out a lot of that fluid that we just chugged. Whereas if we spread it out throughout the day, then our body is more likely to hold on to more of that fluid and actually serve to hydrate us long term. So whenever possible, I suggest spreading it out throughout the day. I know sometimes it's noon and we realize we haven't had any water. So at that point, we might need to be a little bit more aggressive with how much we drink, but it's best to kind of be drinking and sipping throughout the day if possible. Now, in terms of electrolytes, I briefly mentioned this earlier, but I want to kind of circle back on that. So outside of exercise, on a day-to-day basis, it's become very popular to add electrolytes to beverages just throughout the day, just because people think that that's going to serve to hydrate them better than water alone. When you look at the typical American diet, like I said, most of us are getting a surplus of sodium in our diet. So that is usually not something that is necessary. So if you look at a lot of products that are sold as electrolyte supplements, they're very high in sodium. So if you think about Liquid IV or Element, those types of products that are marketed as kind of daily hydrators, the main electrolyte in them is sodium. Most of the time, on a day-to-day basis, outside of the context of training, we do not need to be consuming extra sodium. So as long as we focus on just consuming a balanced diet, if we season our food, we're likely going to get enough sodium through our food sources alone. Especially if you eat out sometimes, any restaurant meal is going to be high in sodium. And if you eat any amount of processed items, they're also going to have sodium. So we don't need to be, in addition to that, adding electrolytes to our fluid outside of training. Potassium and magnesium, those are things, like I said, that come from very healthy food sources. So we really just want to focus on incorporating some of those healthy foods into our diet. So nuts and seeds and dark leafy greens, fruits, vegetables, those types of things are just going to allow us to meet our needs for those electrolytes. I will say magnesium is sometimes more difficult to consume adequate amounts of. So there are cases where consuming a magnesium supplement can be beneficial. It also has some benefit in terms of muscle recovery and those types of things. So in some cases, we do see that electrolyte supplementation with magnesium and sometimes calcium can be helpful, but definitely we don't need to be adding a bunch of electrolyte powders to our water throughout the day. Some people do it just because it makes them drink more, but if we can add flavor through sliced fruit and those types of things during the day, that's a good alternative to just plain water too. So that is my recommendation for kind of daily hydration outside of exercise.